Can everyone hear me? Hello. Hello. Can everyone hear me? Good. Excellent. Excellent. So very, very good evening to those of you who are in Asia. A very good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe and Africa. And a very good morning to those of our friends joining from the Americas. Now, without further ado, we will crack on about the Belt and Road Initiative. Those of our friends joining us later, we'll keep adding them. This is the second public lecture, as I have mentioned. We'll be doing a series of lectures on key issues of importance around the world. I am going to be sharing a presentation with you. And the presentation will be in PowerPoint. And if you cannot see it, please mention that in your chat. The idea is to make certain facts and figures easily digestible. Of course, the idea is not to drown you in data. The idea is not at all to have you through a boring summary of facts and figures. And I'm going to be sharing a screen with you. And if you have problems seeing it, please speak up. The idea is that you should be able to follow as I say what I say, and we get a pictorial understanding of some of the topics. All right. There we go. Share screen. Screen. All right. Can you see my screen? Right. All right. These are niggling issues with Zoom, which I'm mastering. And there we go. All right. There we are. All right. There we go. So the Belt and Road Initiative. Before we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, it's a good idea to see what might be the various roots of the Belt and Road Initiative. We'll get into the genesis of the Belt and Road Initiative. We'll get into what it all means. But this is a very quick picture that gives you, and this is from the Council of Foreign Relations, that gives you an idea of what we mean by China's Belt and Road Initiative. Well, to give you a bit of a backdrop, President Xi Jinping on September 8, 2013, in a speech in Nazarbayev University, where he was speaking at the invitation of Kazakhstan President Nursultan Nazarbayev, said that a near neighbor is better than a distant relative. Now, of course, him being Chinese, he was referring to Chang Qian. And this legendary envoy of the Han dynasty came to Central Asia 2,100 years ago. Talk about memory. The Chinese seem to have a lot of it. And According to Xi, this was a mission of peace and friendship, and it led to the ancient Silk Road linking East and West, Asia and Europe. Now, Xi did not forget to remind his friends or his listeners that his province, Shanxi, his home province, was the starting point for this legendary Silk Road. And Almaty, the current capital of Kazakhstan, was on this Silk Road as well. So while speaking at Almaty, he was at the same time harking back to ancient glory and looking into the future. He was peering into the future. It was a vision that he was giving. And it was a vision that promised an economic belt along the Silk Road. It is now known as the Belt and Road Initiative. And when it was born, right at its outset, it was supposed to have 5 prongs. One was increased policy communication, whatever that means. B, improved connectivity across Asia. We do know what that means. It means ports, it means roads, it means railways, it means better transport. It meant unimpeded trade. The third prong was unimpeded trade, which de facto means Chinese goods, perhaps services, could flow across to Central Asia and elsewhere, and commodities could come back to China, very similar to perhaps a sort of trade that the Europeans practiced in the 19th century. Enhanced monetary circulation. This is code for more people using the Chinese currency instead of using the dollar, and of course, the last one was about better understanding among people of different countries. So the 5 prongs of the Belt and Road Initiative were born, and barely a month later, Xi gave another speech in Indonesia. Again, he invoked ties going back to the Han dynasty. But this time, he put more emphasis on a legendary 15th century Chinese admiral called Zheng. Now, those of you who don't know about this fine chap might, we'll get into that, might get a bit of a briefing on him later in the presentation. And he led 7 voyages, and he visited Indonesia amongst other places. But what he did was he created a naval power base for China in a way that had never been done before and has never been done since. He was Muslim. He was a eunuch. He was a tall, striking man, and he has become the stuff of legend. And in particular these days, as China embarks on its program to create a blue water navy and impose itself away from its shores, he's been rediscovered after being cast into oblivion for a few centuries. So the key thing, however, is not that he was just harking back. She was harking back to old ancient glory. She was very clever in touching upon a raw nerve for Southeast Asia. And that raw nerve was the shock therapy that the International Monetary Fund imposed on Asia in 1997. Basically, austerity was inflicted with absolute brutality. And in many countries, it wasn't just the local economy, but also the social contract itself that collapsed. And this trauma, in part, has led to the Asians keeping large dollar reserves because they don't want to be subject to the will of the International Monetary Fund again. Now, important thing here is that she rejected the one-size-fits-all development model, which was code for saying that, look, we are not like the International Monetary Fund. We are not villains who will come in and destroy your economy. We are actually, and I quote, we are going to share opportunities for economic and social development with ASEAN, Asia, and the world. Now, this is extremely important because what she was doing here is he was trying to lure Indonesia which is a former Dutch colony, which has had strong ties as a supplier of commodities to the West into the Chinese orbit. And the Belt and Road Initiative today, and let's look at a few numbers, and the best figures come, and the best representation comes from this website called China Power. Now let's go to China Power, and yes, and you will see in China Power, in the website, very clearly you will see that the number of countries which, or the global population touched upon by the Belt and Road Initiative is 4.6 billion. If you add up the population of all the countries in which the Belt and Road Initiative operates, it is 4.6 billion, and that is 61% of the world's population. That's a staggering figure. That's an absolutely staggering figure. Now let's move on to this next figure that is incredible. The GDP, the combined GDP of all countries involved is 29 trillion. Now, that is again a staggering figure. 6 trillion is the trade between China and the countries. And I'll move this around a bit so that you can see it a bit better. Between 2014 and let's see, so that you can see it. All right, let me move it a bit. Let me move this a bit. Between 2014 and 2017, in the 3-year period, the trade figures are absolutely staggeringly high. All right, so let's move on to another figure. The low and middle income partners have an average per capita income of $3,875, and China has a per capita income of, in PPP terms, I suspect, it's 16,760. And the total infrastructure needs, and you can see the figures, 26 trillion, and China has just promised 1 trillion of that 26. So presumably the rest of the 25 has to come from somewhere, and the countries will have to either chip in themselves or take loans or whatever. So the interesting thing is there are staggering figures involved, and China is making a massive investment. But the vision for this whole for the Belt and Road Initiative is a rather grandiose. It is certainly not lacking in ambition. And speaking of ambition, this is the classic example of ambition. Now you can see this is the Karakoram Highway. Now this is bloody difficult engineering. This is engineering which involves cutting tunnels, building roads through high passes. It involves working in freezing conditions, dealing with snow, landslides, and whatnot. And the Karakoram Highway, 1,000 years later, probably might go down as one of the great engineering marvels, even for a country with the Great Wall of China, even for a country known for its civil engineering. This is ridiculously, outlandishly spectacular. And of course, this sort of stuff makes India very nervous, because as you can see, this highway is running to Pakistan. Our dearest friends across the border, our twins separated at birth. And shall we say we have a very friendly relationship with our twin. And because of that, any project such as this, which connects our biggest neighbor to the north with our twin to the west, any project is bound to make India very nervous. Now, but that is not the point here. The point was about Chinese ambition, Chinese expertise, and Chinese civil engineering wherewithal. Now, you can see this says it all about Chinese chutzpah, about Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the important thing to note here is that there are 43. Now, this is a breakdown of partners of the Belt and Road Initiative, 43 from Asia, 40 from Africa. That's a rather high number. Europe, again, another high number. America is 19. Well, that means China is expanding not just close to its borders, but going all the way to Brazil, which, by the way, is a supplier of commodities. Soybeans go from Brazil, beef goes from Brazil, iron ore goes from Brazil. Latin America, which used to supply commodities to the US, and its biggest trading partner was, for the last few centuries, the US. After all, both North and South America were colonized by Europeans, one by the Spanish, and of course Brazil by the Portuguese, and the other by the British. The French were beaten out after the 7 Years' War, so there was bound to be some cultural affinity. There was bound to be, as a result of Monroe Doctrine, close ties, and Latin America was the hinterland, first of Europe and then of North America. It supplied commodities as the US industrialized, and of course the Panama Canal was built, and of course Panama was a part of Colombia, and the US lopped it off and created a new country. But the whole point about going on about the number of partners in the Americas is that the Belt and Road Initiative is now in American backyard. So far, there are no missiles, as in Cuba. There is no Cuban Missile Crisis, but America has memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so naturally America is bound to feel nervous. Now, let's go back. We were speaking about memories, American memories, which are rather brief, powerful though they may be, particularly about Cuba. Let's talk about Chinese memories. And Chinese memories, and this is a Chinese junk ship, and it is in the National Maritime. This is a painting of a Chinese junk ship. This is not a Chinese junk ship. I apologize. It is a painting of a Chinese junk ship, and you can find it in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And I have to keep an eye out, and I have to keep adding people. So apologies if my flow is interrupted. I prefer in-person meetings, but we are living in the age of COVID-19, so this is the next best alternative. And this Chinese junk ship for years carried cargo around the world. It carried fabled Chinese goods. And to give an idea of its size, or before the size, I was talking about memories of the past. To give an idea of the reason this is redolent in Chinese memory is because of a certain chap called Zheng, which I have mentioned right at the beginning. He embarked on 7 voyages from 1405 to 1433, and you can see apparently he went all the way to the Middle East, to Mecca. He was a Muslim after all, so going to Hajj was presumably a religious duty, and only a few could accomplish it. And as a great admiral, he probably did accomplish it. He, of course, landed up in India. As per rumor, some martial arts went from Kerala to China. Some people say even the Shaolin arts came from India. We don't know because we don't have a clear record. But the whole point is these voyages were extensive. They certainly led to cultural contact, and they should have led to China becoming the top dog in naval power. That didn't happen, and that is surprising, because if you look at how the ships compare, the ships of Zheng He versus Columbus. Columbus's ship is tiny. Now, this is, of course, something we've taken from Art Station, and we thought this was very educational. If you have such a large ship moving towards such a small ship, well, the small ship, if it has cannons, it might do some damage. But even so, it could literally be run over or run down or sunk down by the weight of such a large ship. And the big question is, such a large navy, 7 voyages, and what happened? Why didn't China emerge as the imperial power? Why instead did the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and the Dutch and the French emerge as the nations who conquered the world? Now, there are lots of history books written on it. Sapiens deals with this question. Yuval Noah Harari, he's a bright chap, another Oxford chap. although he did a PhD. I merely did philosophy, politics, and economics. So clearly I'm not in his league. But the important thing is that for some reason, the Europeans did have this pressure to go out and conquer, to trade, whilst the Chinese voyages presumably probably were just for tribute. And even though they had big ships, what happened was eventually in 1525, the magnificent navy, as a result of court politics, there was a lot of argument in court that these were white elephants, these cost too much, they added no great advantage to the Chinese empire. And at that time, there was threat of internal rebellion. There was always in China, there's always been a fear of invaders coming in across from the west. Of course, lest we forget, the Mongols did conquer China, and later the Manchus did. So the Chinese scrapped their navy. They either let it rot or they burnt it, and the Europeans were left with absolutely no competition. And China, you could argue, went into slumber. It went into splendid isolation. That was rudely broken when the British showed up and fought opium wars and took Hong Kong and blackened the face of the Middle Kingdom. And China till today has never got over that deep sense of humiliation, that it let go of the first prize of being top dog in the world. And China went through a lot of turmoil in the 20th century. This is certainly not a lecture on Chinese history. We are not going to discuss the Boxer Rebellion, the Long March, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. That wouldn't be a good use of your time. But suffice to say, sometime in 1978, and it is particularly important to remember that date, China turned the corner and embarked, and this is Deng Xiaoping's legendary words: "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." And lo and behold, China opened up to markets and grew spectacularly, and so spectacularly did it grow that if you look at the export of goods and services of China, they were below 5%, and they shot up in 2006 to a ridiculously high figure. And of course, they've come down since, but they are still significant. And as we examine Chinese economy, it's important to take a step back and see what China's dramatic rise and what it's embarking on something like the Belt and Road Initiative has done. The Council of Foreign Relations has called the BRI the most ambitious infrastructure investment effort in history. If we were to go by what the CFR says, it worries that BRI is a plan to remake the global balance of power. It could be a Trojan horse for Chinese-led regional development, and I quote here: regional development, military expansion, and Beijing-controlled institutions. The CFR, Council for Foreign Relations, worries about the scale, scope, and speed of the project. Now, of course, in Chinese speak, people like Wang Yiwei of Renmin University reassure the world that look, all we want is lasting peace, common security, common prosperity, openness and inclusiveness, and shared and sustainable development. Shared and sustainable development. Now, what could be wrong with that? We'll share our development experience. We will not interfere in internal affairs of other countries. We won't tell you to bring in democracy if you're an African dictator, or your Nur Sultan Nazarbayev will be all right if you want more power to your daughter. We won't be preaching to you. We won't do what fathers do, and you will not be like Madonna. You will not be singing "Papa, don't preach." We will be a permissive Papa. You can bring back boys home late at night, and we won't demur. Now, that may or may not be true, but that is certainly the Chinese claim. And to understand the clash of narratives going on here, we have to understand something very, very fundamentally. For China, and for China, it's construction frenzy, and it's nothing but a construction frenzy. You cannot create something like the Karakoram Highway unless you are in like a singing dervish. Constantinople was breached through such frenzy, and it's now called Istanbul. But the point is, for China, it is something fundamental to their vision, not just of the past and of the future. They are looking back to two outreaches they did in the past. One outreach was to Central Asia, and the other was the Voyages that came much later. And what they are doing is they are trying to create not just an economic set of relationships. They are planning 50 special economic zones like Shenzhen, but they're also tying together a link of countries that will be geopolitically more aligned. And this frenzy is rooted, if I may point to you, in the mass industrialization of China. And you can see the export figure. I've stayed here to talk about what has led to such dramatic increase in exports. Well, what China did after 1978 is it used its massive labor arbitrage, that the fact that cost of labor was so low, to follow an export-led model and to become the factory of the world. The question arises, why did the US allow it to become the factory of the world? After all, the US was top dog. Why did Europe import from China, for instance? And part of the answer lies in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Remember that by 1969, Soviet and Chinese relationship was at a low ebb. They had fought a border war. And by 1979, China fought with Vietnam, which had been a thorn in the American side. And so what was happening here was that when China took reforms in 1978, the US was itching to wean China away from the Soviet Union. Remember, Nixon went to China. Remember, Kissinger negotiated, Henry Kissinger, no less, negotiated directly with Deng Xiaoping. And it was Deng, of course, who later set China on the course of reform. And there was a geopolitical angle, but there was another angle. Manufacturing in the Middle Kingdom improved the bottom line of shareholders. After all, as more and more stuff was manufactured in China, Walmart's bottom line improved. Hell, Apple's bottom line improved. Foxconn, the manufacturer of the biggest contract manufacturer of electronics items, is making all the iPhones everyone is using, or not all perhaps, but a large number of the iPhones that people are using around the world. It is designed in Cupertino in California. It is manufactured in China, in Foxconn, and they make their workers work very hard. And when some of them tried to commit suicide, they came up with a very innovative way to stop suicides. They just put safety nets around the building. So if you jumped off the roof, you fell in the safety net. So if you have a wonderfully efficient system like that, what that means is that Apple can have higher and higher profits. Apple can have huge cash reserves, and Apple can emerge as the most capitalized company in the world, beating, of course, the likes of ExxonMobil, which, of course, are in trouble right now because the oil price has gone through the floor. So it was in the interests of the American shareholders. Yes, American consumers were happy too. It was in the interest of American consumers. They got cheap stuff. Chinese workers were happy. And so for all these years, Chinese workers, of course, Chinese manufacturers, American shareholders, American consumers, they were all happy. But as with anything. Trade is, the cliche goes, it's a win-win, and it can be a win-win, but all trade, particularly global trade, has winners and losers. And the American worker lost out big time. Of course, the wise men in charge of the US economy told the worker that told the workers that their pain was short-term. Oracles like Bob Rubin and Larry Summers, who was actually speaking at Princeton yesterday, they proclaimed that a more integrated world economy with freer movement of capital would lead to cheaper products, better paid jobs, and a cleaner environment. In 1991, when Summers was in the World Bank, he proposed that many poorer countries were underpolluted and toxic industries could move there from the first world. Now, of course, it's a jolly good idea if you want to take walks in Central Park and not have too much pollution, or walk down from the Capitol Hill to the White House and then on to the World Bank. And perhaps there is an argument, a highly rigorous argument to be made that developing countries were willing to make the trade-off, were and are willing to have higher pollution so as to gain income. After all, in the 19th century, Britain industrialized, and the externality, as economists like to call it, was pollution, higher pollution. The Thames was black, and you can read Charles Dickens, if you haven't already, to read about how London was covered with soot. So perhaps it is the rites of passage. The price for greater prosperity is pollution. And Larry Summers was right. Developing countries perhaps were a bit underpolluted. And his gospel of trade seemed to be the dominant religion throughout the 90s. But even in the 90s, and some people here, I can see some people attending this lecture, and some people clearly have memories of the 1990s. Not everyone. There are some, of course, who were born in the 1990s and have no memory at all, except perhaps of getting ice cream from their grandparents. But some people do have memories of 1992, when Ross Perot warned against one-way trade deals. He talked about a giant sucking sound of jobs going south. And he did pretty well. In fact, Bill Clinton would not be president if Ross Perot hadn't taken away votes from George Bush Sr. And people like Ross Perot clearly lost the popular mandate. And if greed was good in the era of Ronald Reagan, globalization was glorious in the age of Clinton. And remember, this is also the age when the Soviet Union has collapsed. 1991 has happened. It is also the age when Francis Fukuyama is talking about the end of history. Western liberal democracy is seen as the inevitable future, the promised land to which all of humanity, irrespective of race and religion and geography and history, is destined to get to. It is the new Garden of Eden. It is the second coming, perhaps, of the idyllic, if not of Christ, of the idyllic paradise from which we've fallen. Anyway, long story short, globalization was a jolly good idea. The US championed the entry of China into the WTO. And of course, the Middle Kingdom dutifully followed Deng Xiaoping's maxim, hide your strength, bide your time. It industrialized much as the US did in the 19th century. It stole trade industrial secrets, it protected key sectors, and it gave manufacturing steroids, such as massive infrastructure spending and cheap credit. So China grew dramatically, and it's inevitably started making Americans nervous. And there was a response. We've all heard of Thucydides' trap, or maybe I'm being presumptuous. Some of us have most certainly heard of Thucydides' trap. And basically, a ruling power, and the logic is, it's an argument by a rather famous professor at Harvard Kennedy School. His name is Graham Allison. And sorry, I'm trying to move this away. It's proving rather truculent. I will Yes, just a second. I will endeavor to have it out of your way. All right. I will, yeah, I'll move it around a bit. Okay, good. There we go. So, the argument of Thucydides' trap is that a ruling power and a rising power are inevitably destined for clash. It goes back to Herodotus, the first historian in the Western world, who talked about Greece, ancient Greece, and the inevitable battle between Sparta and Athens. And of course, modern-day Sparta arguably is China. I don't know if it is. I don't think the Chinese have compulsory military service, but relatively speaking, and modern-day Athens is America. I think Rome would be a more accurate description, but you get the point. The idea is not so much whether it's exactly Athens or Sparta. The idea is whether it will lead to conflict. And his argument, Allison's argument, is that it has been observed in the past that when Britain rose in 1588, it had a bish-bosh with Spain, and then of course the French and the British had a bish-bosh in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and you could argue that the Anglo-French struggle continued until Waterloo, when Napoleon was conclusively absolutely defeated, and the French have always been number two to the UK since. Maybe Brexit might change that. And of course, then you had the World War I, when a rising Germany wanted parity with the UK, also with France on the continent, and that led to bish bosh bash. The point is, conflicts in the past have emerged, have broken out between ruling and rising powers. That may be a risk again. And Obama's response was jiu-jitsu. Let's wean away countries in the Pacific, both in the Americas and Asia, away from the bosom of China. China's muscular arms might crush the ribs of those it embraces, and instead we will welcome them and develop the greatest trading region in the world, and it'll be the fastest growing trading region in the world. And as the Germans, or as there's a saying in German, man proposes and God laughs, or man, in English we say man proposes, God disposes. Something happened. That something was Donald Trump, and TPP went out of the window. And if Obama chose jiu-jitsu, Trump opted for a bar fight, and we must realize that it is not just Donald Trump who has turned against China. The zeitgeist has changed in America. Thomas Friedman is no Republican. He is a Democrat. He is a celebrity columnist for the New York Times, and he has declared that China now deserves Trump. And he said China is no longer making toys, t-shirts, tennis shoes, machine tools, and solar panels. It is competing with the US in supercomputing, artificial intelligence, new materials, 3D printing, facial recognition software, robotics, electric cars, autonomous vehicles, 5G wireless, and advanced microchips. So China is now a rival. Its subsidies, protectionism, cheating on trade rules, forced technology transfers, and stealing of intellectual property since the 1970s have become a much greater threat. And Friedman, according to Friedman, it doesn't matter if the Chinese were communists, Maoists, socialists, or cheats. What matters is they are a competitor. Values matter, differences in values matter, a modicum of trust matters, and the rule of law matters. And tellingly, after all my research, I found that it was a Democrat trumpeter who gave the clearest clarion call for a new Cold War. No one has made the case for a new Cold War better than Thomas Friedman. And so it's ironic that here is a Democrat who probably despises Trump, clearly unlikely. It's very unlikely, given from reading his writings, that he likes, far aside loves Donald Trump, loves the Republican president, but he is making a case for Trumpian policies on China. So to quote a certain singer who's now won the Nobel Prize, the times indeed are changing. We live in strange times indeed, and it's not just COVID-19 that is making times strange. So obviously, the US started turning the screws on China right with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Inevitably, the Chinese had to respond and did respond. As the US sought to chop down the Chinese tall poppy, China did two big things under Xi. First, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, which we've talked about. And the second was Made in China, which Thomas Friedman alludes to. The choosing of 10 high-tech national industries, the 10 high-tech industries as a national focus, because Make in China 2025 is China's bid to get out of the middle income trap, which brings me on to this slide that you can see and you've been seeing for a while. And this slide shows you that China is still in per capita terms, and of course this is not in I don't think this is in PPP terms. It is in nominal terms, and we can see that that China is still at a measly $8,000 when it comes to per capita annual income, and the US figure is $56,000, or well, it may have fallen, of course, with COVID-19, but the middle kingdom is, it's still, it's maybe not a poor country, but it's still a relatively poor country, and it is extremely nervous of remaining in the middle income trap. After all, Latin America is in the middle income trap. After all, China could continue making iPhones for Apple, and the bulk of the profits could keep going to Apple. So China clearly wants to provide subsidies, make foreign acquisitions, and close the gap with the West. It wants intellectual property. It wants intellectual know-how. That's part of the reason why Chinese students are coming out to study in the West in large numbers. Of course, part of the reason is many want to stay. They want to escape China altogether. But a lot of them do go back, and part of it is, of course, status, a Western education. There is still cultural hegemony of the US and indeed the West. But part of it is this hunger for know-how and technological knowledge. And what is strange about the current phenomenon, given the one current phenomenon, which I'll explain, given the disparity in per capita incomes, is that China has been purchasing American debt. It is a poor country that has been lending lending a rich country money. Way back, in my early years, when I just got out of Oxford, I wrote an article called "The Yankee Doodle and Dragon Dance," and I argued the Yankee Doodle and Dragon Dance had to end. And the dance was simple. The dance was really Americans were consuming too much, the Chinese were producing too much, and buying too much American debt. And for me, the elephant in the room was about to trumpet, and trumpet it has now, pun intended. First, or let me take a step back. That trumpeting means that the end of the model is nigh. The end of the globalization model, the end of the model, the export-led model, the end of the model as per which China got on the autobahn with no speed limits and just boom became a massive manufacturer. And that end is nigh for three reasons. Number one, of course, is American sanctions. American sanctions have dampened demand for Chinese goods. Second, of course, and this is what most people don't know, and I was lucky enough to run into Antoine van Achtemeil, who came up with the term emerging economies. He's a donor to Fair Observer as well, for full disclosure. And I reviewed his book, in fact, the book he had co-authored with Fred Bakker, and their thesis was very simple. Their thesis was smart is going to replace cheap. You're going to have a shortening of supply lines because you have new materials. You have the combination of hardware and software. You have brain belts emerging out of rust belts. You have additive manufacturing, which makes the differential in labor costs relatively inconsequential. And factories are going to come back to the US, maybe not for everything, maybe not for the cheapest things, but yeah, a lot of the manufacturing that you felt had gone away is coming back. And I've been told by a number of friends in politics that come 2021, this trend will receive a big boost, because whoever wins, whether it is Joe Biden or whether it is Donald Trump, the US Congress is going to pass a series of stimulus measures. Now, that information may be incorrect, but I'm inclined to believe that that is likely to happen. Everyone is talking about making their own country. We are going back to an era of protectionism. And the West, places like Saxony, places like Eindhoven, places like Akron, Ohio, places like Batesville, Mississippi. We are not just talking about Silicon Valley, by the way, or for that matter, Seattle area. We're talking about these areas that were designated as dumps. They may make, and they are already, actually, they are already making strong comebacks. They are making polymers, they are making shoes, they are making new materials for clothing. They are making all sorts of stuff, and they have the cheap standard of living. They have a culture of freedom. They have a culture of collaboration, and in some ways, China's goose will be cooked bit by bit. The oven is only beginning to heat up. And the third reason, which many talk about, particularly David Petraeus, who used to be the spy master for the US. He was head of the CIA. He's a retired general. We've interviewed him on Fair Observer as well. And David's point is that an energy revolution has quietly transformed the US. Energy prices actually are below $2 per million British thermal units. I know there is someone who invests in energy, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. And here is, you can see energy prices, of course, have gone down. You could argue in relative terms, yeah, they've stayed more or less stable. They were near $5 in the late 90s, and okay, they are down, but what's the big deal? I mean, even if energy is cheap, there have been only a few spikes. So, yeah, it's cheap, but it's always been cheap. And that would hold true. That logic would hold true, but for the next slide. And this is important. And you can see what's happened to energy production. And of course, it's gone staggeringly high. And what that means is that those who pipe in their energy or bring it on ships such as Japan or China or even Europe, they are relying on Russia, have a huge competitive disadvantage. This is an extraordinary competitive advantage, in the words of David, for the US. So the US is very well placed now to bring back manufacturing, combine the three things: sanctions with new manufacturing, and then the third thing is lowering energy prices. And the economic landscape has changed, as it always does every few decades. But this means that if that is the direction the compass is pointing forwards, for the American economy and perhaps for the European economy, China will be left with even more excess capacity. After all, China has basically dramatically expanded production in all kinds of things. Look at China's cement production. It's grown ridiculously high. Yes, it's volatile and it drops and it rises, but you can see that it's producing a lot of cement. China's steel production, I mean, look at that. That's incredible. Of course, China is building railways left, right, and center. I mean, it just built 6,800 kilometers of new high-speed railways last year. The total length has crossed 30,000 kilometers. It's carrying 3.4 billion passengers and 3.37 billion tons of goods. It's got all this civil engineering expertise, along with iron and steel, along with cement, along with millions of workers who need jobs. So what does it do with its excess capacity? Well, it can take a leaf out of America's book. It can have its own Marshall Plan. And what that means, very simply, is that just as British firms once built railways and roads and ports in Africa and India, Chinese ones are now doing the same in Central Asia and Africa and elsewhere. And this big economic stimulus is not just to the regions where they are building this infrastructure, but also to China, because China can, use its excess capacity. Its factories don't come to a whirring halt. Its workers are suddenly not out of work. Then, of course, there is a second factor at play why China is investing abroad. It's not just excess capacity, it is to diversify its assets. We talked about China holding dollar reserves, huge dollar reserves, and the value of dollar is plummeting, and China has kept its currency fixed. So it may be importing inflation at home as well. And so one of the ways to diversify China's assets is you invest in infrastructure, because that's where you have the most experience, and you use your excess capacity and you get assets that will bring in revenue over time. And of course, as you build assets in other countries, what you can do is you can start selling your goods and services. And the global savings glut, which Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, has talked about, which means that literally means that when desired spending exceeds desired investment, you find a way to use your global your share of the global savings glut. Apparently, Germany and China, in the words of Bernanke, are guilty of this, and they should be spending more to stimulate both domestic demand and global demand. And BRI serves many purposes. There is another factor at play, which many people forget. The one way to look at it is the way Americans look at it, or for that matter, Deutsche Welle, which made a fantastic documentary, very entertaining, very, very enjoyable, about the new Silk Road moving across high mountains in Asia and exotic locations right into the heart of Europe. And Deutsche Welle compared China's constructions of roads, railways, bridges, tunnels, and ports to Rome's imperial needs. And if one was to believe the Germans, China is a supremely confident power with a vision and energy to become the preeminent global power as it was for most of its history. That's just the arc of destiny. And you and I have all get to used to the phenomenon of the Chinese coming back. The Chinese are not rising; they're just making a comeback to their rightful place in the universe. And we just haven't read the memo. That is one view. Another view, when I talk to the Chinese, and that's very interesting, the Chinese do not quite have the same sagacious, supremely confident view of their country. In fact, they have pride. They have a ton of pride, but they are deeply anxious. In fact, they have three big fears. And all these three fears are reminiscent of Japanese fears before World War II. Now, remember that the Japanese had built industrial might, but did not have captive markets. Unlike the British, they had come late to the colonial party. Or colonies like the Spanish or the French. So they didn't have captive markets in the form of colonies, and they didn't have access to sources of energy, unlike the British. Neither did the Germans, actually. So China's first fear is running short of energy. And that is why you can see that it is reaching out to the Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia for oil and gas. And the Middle Kingdom has coal, but it does not have energy like the US. It does not have easy access to energy, unlike Europe. The US Navy could block the Straits of Malacca in hours, bringing Chinese cars, trucks, trains, and planes to a halt. That's part of the reason China is investing big in solar power. That's part of the reason China wants to move to clean energy. Yes, pollution is a key figure. Most of China is horrendously polluted. So Larry Summers has been proven right. It was good to shift industries to China. After all, you get clean air in Hampstead Park. In London, you can go running there. Of course, you can go running in St. James's Park and many parks in London. And you can have clean air in Berlin. But if you also want cheap goods in your supermarkets, then it's good that those factories are located in some little or big town in China, like Chongqing or Wuhan. Who cares? They're poor. They want to get rich, so it's all right. They can make the same trade-off which Germany and Britain and the US did in earlier times. But the long and short of it is that yes, that pollution is leading China to move to clean energy, but the fear of being cut off energy sources by not just the US, but also perhaps Russia. If Russia's no benign power, right? It hasn't been for a while. So the Chinese fear of being cut off energy sources is leading to Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, the second fear is Xinjiang. China is constantly criticized these days in places like Al Jazeera, New York Times, BBC for the treatment of its Muslim Uyghur minority. And approximately 1 million Uyghurs are in re-education camps. So apart from the stick of repression, China is using the carrot of development. It is investing in Belt and Road Initiative, and consequently, Imran Khan, the fantastically handsome, intelligent, and sexy Prime Minister of Pakistan, he was once a sex symbol, not just for England but for Bollywood. He claims not to have heard of what's going on in Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. He has a miraculous lapse in memory, because you really can't express much solidarity with your fellow religious men and women if you're getting massive dollops of money. And in some ways, what China is doing is it's trying to quell the rest of the region of Xinjiang, which possibly may want to be separate from China, or may want to join another neighboring Central Asian country, which historically has had ties with Central Asian countries. So it is using the stick of repression and the carrot of development. We'll build trains, we will build roads, and Suhasini Haider, an Indian analyst and writer, said most aptly that Xinjiang is both at the heart of China's biggest worries and is one of its greatest hopes. So you built the land part of the central of the Belt and Road Initiative. You keep Xinjiang quiet. China remains one, unified, and continues to rise. The third fear, of course, is that the US and Europe, which humiliated China in the 19th century, the Summer Palace was sacked, the winter, and in Beijing, may put glass ceilings. Meng Wanzhou, a top executive in Huawei, has been arrested in China at the behest of the US, and Chinese investment, once welcomed, now causes disquiet in Europe and the US. So if you look at it from the Chinese perspective, they genuinely believe that Western media and intelligence is fomenting discord in Hong Kong. It basically is painting China's face with black paint, and it has to reach out. It has to invest in other countries to have its own form of interdependency to combat the wily Westerners who will cut it off at its knees. And that is why you can see Xi, when he showed up in 2017 to Davos, he gave a fantastic speech singing paeans to economic globalization. Of course, China has benefited most from it, but he was trying to sound, or he was almost sounding American in his commitment to free trade. After all, free trade, the idea of free trade was born in Anglo-Saxon lands. We can thank Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and then of course Anglo-Saxon cultures such as the US, Canada, and Australia swore by it. The French, of course, have their tradition of mercantilism and dirigisme, and the Germans, of course, have a different model. They've always had a greater state intervention. So for a Chinese president, given that country's history of mercantilism, for a Chinese president to talk about free trade and bang on while an American president is imposing tariffs in Davos was nothing short of incongruous. We certainly do live in strange times. The times, they are changing, and BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, we have to understand, is not just causing disquiet in the West. Near neighbors, India and China fought a war in '62. India got beaten quite soundly. Vietnam and China fought a war in 1979. This time the Vietnamese managed to score one against the Chinese. They didn't just beat the Americans, they also beat the Chinese, or sort of they did. And of course, Japan, which has a history of love, profound love, at least on the part of the Japanese. It was just that the Chinese never were able to understand Japanese love. They always misunderstood Japanese love as racism and hate and rape. But of course, China and Japan have a tangled history, particularly from the 1930s. And Japan now is extremely nervous about China's increasing might. So Japan is taking the lead in countering the Belt and Road Initiative. It has its own $200 billion infrastructure plan for the broader Indian Ocean area, and it is partnering up with India. They're chaotic and the super organized. We'll see how that tango goes. But there's a bit of a push. Actually, there is pushback from Japan, in particular. Vietnam and India have disquiet. There is, even in countries which are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, there is resentment, if not backlash. Pakistan has seen suicide attack on Chinese engineers. Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Hungary, and elsewhere, you have dissent and disquiet. Hambantota, apparently, everyone talks about it in India, was won by the Chinese on a 99-year-old lease for writing off Sri Lankan debt. All that is going on. So the Belt and Road Initiative is not a straightforward affair that everyone is singing kumbaya. It's causing problems amongst rivals, and it's causing problems. It's causing problems even amongst recipients of that aid and people who are supposed to be friends. And along with the rivals and resentment, China is dealing with turf wars at home. Remember 1525, the fleet was basically destroyed because of internal party politics. And in China, the threat of internal rebellion is never far off. Perhaps part of the reason China never became a great empire is because internal rebellion was a far bigger deal than in Europe. It was an empire before. It was a big state. It was the first state long before others did. It's got ethnic minorities. It's got a party that is increasingly ruled by a modern-day emperor. It has massive issues with meeting the expectations of its people. The Iron Bull, which is the Chinese social contract, the party takes care of providing rising living standards, whilst people offer offer the party their unquestioned obeisance. That itself may be under threat if the economy tumbles, because unlike democracies where things can go awry as well, after all, I'm very skeptical of saying democracies are going to triumph like Francis Fukuyama. I think that's naive. In the past, democracies have imploded. After all, the Buddha came from a democracy and was taken over by Magad, which was a monarchy. Athens as a democracy degenerated and eventually lost in the Peloponnesian Wars. So democracies can degenerate too. I don't think there's anything inevitable about democracy. In fact, democracies are invariably frail. If you want to have democracy, you need to have some sense of civic responsibility and civic engagement, and people have to be informed and educated, and you've got to have a sense of shared public purpose. Otherwise, a democracy can degenerate into interest groups squabbling with each other. But democracies, those that develop over time, have resilience because you can vote out people. There's a safety valve. They can correct. There's an autocorrect element to it. After all, the British did vote for Brexit, and the new Johnson government is investing in the north of England. It has corrected course after a long time when the Thatcherite revolution perhaps held sway and perhaps went too far, and that sort of course correction is not possible. And so China has this fear of internal rebellion, and it has turf wars. It has, as does every country that grows to a certain size. There are turf wars in Washington, D.C. The FBI and the CIA, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Central Intelligence Agency rarely coordinate well. They don't really share information. And that is all a matter of public record. Similarly, in Beijing, the foreign commerce and defense ministries are engaged in a fair bit of strife. So there are conflicts of interest that emerge between different companies and involved in far-flung projects and the government. So perhaps the government wants the project to go on, or it wants the project to stop, and the company perhaps wants it to go on when the government wants it to stop, or it perhaps it wants it to stop when the government wants it to go on. So there is a fair bit of incoherence inside such a big project, and of course there are Beijing is having to balance divergent imperatives. One is, of course, one imperative is, how do we get better returns on our foreign exchange reserves? Well, you could. There are profitable projects, but then you've also got the geostrategic element to balance. So there's a real risk for Beijing that BRI may be constructing too many white elephants with little economic or strategic value. And there may be not enough hard, clear, and deep thinking going on. In fact, Yaxing Huang, a professor at MIT, he fears that BRI has huge debts, huge risks of debt default. I have a friend who's British, who is in politics. He will go unnamed, and he jokingly said that China was trying to be the United States. It'll become Uganda. And they tried to create a global project without having a blue water navy. So they are going to crumble to dust. In fact, if there's one statistic that may imply that, is that only 28% of BRI investments in the first half of 2018 came from private sources, and China does indeed not have a blue water navy. It can't send a gunboat over to force the country to pay. So the BRI actually is a massive challenge. It is not an entirely coherent policy. It has instigated a lot of rivalry, some resentment. It may lead to countries defaulting on China's debt as well, and the financial problem for China. It may end up leaving China with white elephants, achieving little strategically or economically. And at the end of the day, China lacks the soft power which Joseph Nye constantly talks about, and whose book I have finally started reviewing. And Joseph Nye talks about how America has won a place in people's mind, and America doesn't just have gunships and fantastic drones and 800 military bases and the ability to kill anyone anywhere and send an aircraft carrier or a fancy fighter jet. It also commands a certain cultural deference, and Harvard and Hollywood command a share of the global imagination. After all, Xi Jinping's daughter came to Harvard to study and not vice versa. I don't think Donald Trump's children will go to Beida to study. So the cultural hegemony of the US and the West still continues. The Belt and Road Initiative, in my view, may have energy, ambition, and even vision, but it is not backed by an inspiring idea. It's not backed by soft power or the idea of democracy, which underpinned the Marshall Plan, and that is its biggest limitation. I have come to the end of my talk. Questions, please. Yes, please. Please ask questions. Ratna has asked a great question. What do you think about the current military standoff in Ladakh? I think there are three things going on. One, of course, China is under a bit of duress internally. It has seen massive economic damage. Second, of course, China is facing a bit of a problem vis-a-vis Taiwan and Hong Kong. And it wants some kind of a change in narrative. And third, of course, is that China is paranoid about India jumping into bed with the US. It fears that India is the Trojan horse, which will slay China at its doorstep. And so you combine all three. Yes, of course, the Chinese might be wanting to distract. The Chinese might be wanting to put India in its place. They might not want India to be the center of manufacturing, companies to move, American companies in particular, to move from China south of the Himalayas. So yes, it is a combination of many things. It's both its internal population and its geopolitical imperatives and economic imperatives as well. Yes. Any other question, or have we come to the end of questions? Oh, we have another question. Just a second. Student of history from BHU. Okay, brilliant. I will stop sharing the screen now. I should have stopped sharing the screen. Okay. I don't understand your question, Yuvika. It is not clear enough. I will try to interpret it. I would advise you to write in shorter sentences and active voice next time, because I'm having trouble understanding what you're really trying to say. Are you saying that there'll be World War III between America and China, or between America and the rest of the world? I don't see that as yet. There could be conflict, but we have nuclear weapons, and it's a dangerous world. And I think the Americans and the Chinese could fight proxy wars going forward. There could be trade. There are certainly trade wars going on. There may be spats between India and China, or Pakistan and India, or China and its neighbors over the South China Sea. But I don't see China and the US fighting war, and I see Europe as sitting it out. I don't know how many of you know that the UK has consciously, and this you can read it, I can send you a memo, those of you who are interested, or a report even. I can send you, I think it's a House of Lords report. The UK has decided to put daylight between itself and the US, because it finds that there is now a divergence of values and interests between the mothership and of course the troublesome child that is now the superpower. Albion Seed, as a book once called it. So Europe is going to stay out of it, and Europe is certainly going to try and do trade. And Europe has its own trouble. Europe has to deal with an aging population, rising pension burdens, and low growth. So the last thing Europe wants is conflict, or getting involved in a conflict. There aren't simply enough young people to die. COVID-19. Okay, Samir Gandhi, a rather eminent gentleman from Mumbai. He's asked how the geopolitical scenario will be evolving post COVID-19 and the oil crisis affecting Belt and Road Initiative in fast-changing and unforeseen scenarios. So one of the things that we, as in me and some other friends who discuss this issue a lot, and they tend to be both British and Asian, and of course some Americans as well. So I shouldn't have used both. But the geopolitical scenario facing China is that as access to markets in the West is shrunk, in particular the US, they will certainly try to develop markets and use their excess capacity to sell things in Central Asia. They will try to sell in Africa. They will try to sell in Southeast Asia. Now, of course, there are too many unknown unknowns, to use Donald Rumsfeld's words. At the end of this crisis, the yuan is going to remain the yuan. The renminbi is going to remain the renminbi. It is never going to be a global currency. We will see America continue to be top dog. We will see China double down on the Belt and Road Initiative. We will see China try and have closer relationships with the likes of Russia, Kazakhstan, Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth, and even Latin America. So I think the geopolitical scenario after post-COVID-19 is going to be one in which China tries to manage the damage that has happened to its reputation and its economy, whilst post-COVID-19, and America is doing a fantastic job with post-COVID-19 in insinuating that it was China's fault. The president is doing that. The Republican congressmen and senators are doing that. Some are demanding damages, and of course influencing opinion in places like India that the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus is responsible for the world's economic collapse, and ipso facto China, which is not just a dangerous power, but a deeply dangerous neighbor, cannot be trusted, should not be trusted, and America should be in the US camp. So I think we will see realignment, strong realignment. India will move closer to the US. It's a trend that was already going on. We will see Chinese reputation take a hit, and we will see the balance of power shift against China, the model on which it has depended for the last few decades. The model which has led to its rise is in question now. So it's not just the Belt and Road Initiative that will change, but also China's political system is going to come under pressure in due course if it's not able to wriggle out of the economic hole it has found itself in, and it is not able to turn its model from an export-led economy to a more demand-oriented economy. And if it cannot develop its internal market, then we could very well see, not tomorrow, not in a year, perhaps not even in 5 years, but in a decade or two, a real pressure on the Communist Party led governance model. In fact, the party itself could go. After all, dynasties have come and gone in China. The Ming dynasty isn't around anymore, nor is the Han dynasty. So there's no reason to assume anything is permanent in life anywhere in the world, and China is no exception. On that note, I've come to an end of my time. It seems I apparently I do have some time. Do I? I do have time for questions. Excellent. I have 11 minutes. I've been reliably told. Okay. So we will go through some questions very quickly, and interest development. Boris Johnson has been opposed to the presence of Tara Whittaker, who is an absolutely brilliant friend of mine in London, has told me that Boris Johnson has been forced to cave to the Conservative backbench rebels, and whoever is out basically of the UK. By 2023, they'll be out. So this, this is a big blow to China. Ayan Rakshit, a student of mine who's off to America to do his PhD, who is very widely read, has asked a question: what are the most important segments of the BRI for China in case they have to reevaluate the rest of it soon? Oh, well. Ayan, that is a tough question, because I think both the land and the sea route are important for different reasons. I said that they need to have, I mean, just as India wants to keep Kashmir, some of you might have seen my video on Kashmir, which came out yesterday in Hindi. But some of you, who've seen that video know that nations are very reluctant to give up land. After all, Britain didn't move from India until the writing was well on the wall. And so Xinjiang is something which is deep for Chinese identity and pride and ideas of sovereignty and whatnot. So, and to keep Xinjiang, of course, they follow repression, but they are also trying to build the land route and build that up as a prosperous area. So the mix of carrot and sticks, and then, everyone gradually over time will become Han, and everyone will speak Chinese, and everyone will trade across the border, and there'll be peace and harmony and economic growth and prosperity, and everyone will sing Kumbaya. So they cannot really compromise on that element. They may cut down some expenditure such as the Karakoram highway, which frankly seems to be a bit of a white elephant. It's a great civil engineering project. It's just phenomenally impressive. When you see videos of how they've constructed stuff, you say, wow, where is my hat so that I can doff it off to Chinese engineers? But what purpose does it really serve in this day and age? Why do you need such a long and winding road when you can just jet it to Pakistan or send a ship if you have a blue water navy? So so maybe there will be elements of it that'll get lopped off. So that's extremely important. But similarly, the naval side is important because the Chinese are terrified of being choked off at the Straits of Malacca. You could choke them off, and then what happens? They can't export anything. They are basically in their Chinese lake, and the Chinese have gone inward once more. And Xi Jinping may have studied engineering. In fact, if I remember correctly, what did he study? He studied chemical engineering. So all of you from IIT should be very pleased, especially all the chemical engineers. You could be prime minister too. So the point is that Xi Jinping is a keen student of history, and he understands what happened when the Chinese destroyed their fleet. And so for them, that's why for them, the coastal or the naval strategic priority is equally important. After all, they want to keep Hong Kong, which is really an island. They also don't want to back down on Taiwan. They're also building islands in South China Sea. So they can't back down on that too. But again, they may invest less in Latin America. They may invest less in Africa. When I went to Dakar late last year, it was very ironic. We had dinner at, there was a fancy event organized in the Musée du Civilisation Noire, which is the Museum of Black Civilizations, but it had been built by the Chinese, and the entire outdoor gym where everyone was exercising by the sea on the sand, that had all been built by the Chinese. So all of these projects, may suffer. The US seems almost naive. Ratna Sanjay says as saying peaceful, just an observation. Okay. Question from Aniket. Okay. When the time comes, should India side with the USA or China? My God, Aniket. I think we should be like Europe. We should stay out of a fight that is not ours. I think we should trade with the Chinese, and we should trade with the Americans, and we should welcome investment from both of them. We don't have much capital. Our savings rate has gone down. Our economy is in the doldrums. There are no jobs. We are looking at a depression. I think we should just stay out of all this fighting and siding, because frankly, we don't have officers, enough officers in the Indian military. We don't have the technical prowess. So we would do jolly well to stay out of a fight. This is the time to build up our economic capacity. This is the time to build up our technological prowess. This is the time to reform our military and indeed our entire administration. This is a time for India to get its house in order. This is the time for India to train, hit the gym. It's not match fit. India cannot go and side with anyone. Should not, in my view. We may, but that would be stupidity in my view. All right, I think we've come to the end of questions, or we have comments. Oh, we do have a question. Jammu and Atishay. Okay, sorry, I missed that. Okay, so Jammu and Atishay, these are the last two questions we take, and then we'll call it a day. I see Karakoram Highway, and we recently visited again. Well, India's response to these actions, Jammu, is improve our economy and improve our military. At the moment, India's military is in a poor condition. We do not have enough weapons. We spend most of our defense budget on salaries and pensions, and we have a problem at the higher level, in the sense there's a real dearth of talent. Most good officers get destroyed at the colonel stage because, well, first you have the accumulated, annual confidential report. I call it the accumulated cream returned model, wherein someone who basically butters up his boss goes up. Then there is the other problem, is that there's a zero error syndrome. So the chap who doesn't make any decisions is likely to go up. The chap who goes on 10 operations is going to get 3 of them wrong. And we have a zero error syndrome. So basically the army is to use a phrase from World War I, it is a pride of lions led by donkeys or jackals or hyenas. Basically, at the top in the Indian military, there is a real dearth of leadership. There is, of course, a shortage of officers right at the second lieutenant, captain, and major stage. So India has to first, if it wants to be taken seriously, it has to reform its military. It's got to make sure, for instance, that the defense ministry, which is staffed by IS officers, and I know and of course some revenue service and some others who come from other allied services, and I know some of my batchmates and seniors who've served as joint secretaries, and I cannot take names, but I can tell you that 2 of them had absolutely not the slightest bit of interest in defense. And that sort of a constitution of a ministry is just ridiculous. It's criminal. In my view, you need scientists, you need military strategists, you need some people, of course, from the military, you need some people from the civil services, you need a mix of talent, you need a real mix of talent from different areas of expertise, so as to come up with a defense strategy. Right now, we have no defense strategy at all. The defense minister is someone in whom I do not have much confidence. So, and I certainly don't have confidence in officials in the ministry. So I think we've got to first get our house in order, and then we can do other stuff. And how will BRI be funded now that these countries have very little money? And the answer is God knows. I think, Atishay, the Belt and Road Initiative may come. Many of the projects may be left half finished because they've run out of money. The International Monetary Fund is headed by a European. It is part of the Bretton Woods order. The World Bank is headed by an American. I don't think the International Monetary Fund is going to pay up for a Belt and Road Initiative project. So I think there's a real danger for the Belt and Road Initiative now that China's economic model is in question, now that China will need money internally for the stimulus. It could end up like the fleet. It could be left to rot. Sorry to go back to 1525. And with that, we are at 6:30. We've come to the end of our time. Thank you for joining me. Please subscribe to our newsletter. Please follow us on social media. By us, I mean Fair Observer. And please spread the word. Thank you. Have a lovely evening in India and in Asia and Australia. Lovely afternoon in Europe and Africa. And have a lovely rest of the day in the Americas. Bye for now.